What happens when the world puts you on a pedestal, but no one notices how high you're teetering? The silent battles, the heartbreak behind the scenes, the cost of being an icon when everyone expects you to shine and no one sees you struggle. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the true stories of 15 classic stars whose fame could not protect them from the shadows. These are the names you thought you knew, and the endings you were never meant to see. Marilyn Monroe. She was the fantasy of millions, her face flickering in movie palaces across continents, the very embodiment of what the world called beauty. But what they never saw was how the light that poured onto Marilyn Monroe only deepened the shadows inside her. Behind every breathless laugh, every flirtatious glance, there was a woman staggering under the weight of loneliness that fame could never fill. She was more than a symbol. She was a survivor, a fighter. But in a world that only wanted her to shimmer on cue, she was left with no one to hear her struggle. By the time she was 36, Marilyn's world was an endless cycle of sleepless nights and forced smiles. The powerful men in her life, directors, politicians, even the highest in the land, took what they wanted and left her with little but rumors and betrayals. The scripts she read were written for dolls, not women with dreams or pain. Her home became both a palace and a prison, cameras always waiting to catch her stumble. She called out to friends, to studios, to anyone who might see the real her. Instead, they prescribed more silence, more pills to numb the restlessness in her heart. On a warm August night, all the bright lights outside her window meant nothing. Inside, the quiet was absolute. The telephone hung loose in her hand, as if she'd tried to reach out, one last time, for help that would never arrive. When they finally broke into her locked room, all they found was a legend extinguished, empty bottles on the table, a voice forever hushed. The world's brightest star had faded, not with applause, but with the kind of silence that swallows everything. George Reeves. He was the face every child trusted, the strong jaw, the heroic smile, the famous crest on his chest. George Reeves was the man of steel on television, the person parents pointed to when their children needed a hero. But while the world cheered for the champion on the screen, the man inside the suit was carrying a burden far heavier than any villain he fought in black and white. Hollywood gave him a costume, a title, and the kind of fame that made strangers treat him like a god. What it never gave him was an escape. George's reality was nothing like the stories that played out for millions on Saturday mornings. After the cameras stopped rolling, he couldn't step out of the shadow of his own role. Studio bosses called him a one-trick pony. Casting agents looked at him and saw nothing but a cape. The same children who once cheered in the street now pointed and demanded to see him fly. He was trapped in the legend everyone else had built for him, while his own dreams faded into the background. Inside his own home, the applause was gone, replaced by a silence that pressed in with each passing day. George's relationships grew tangled, his career stuck in place, his money running dry. He tried to drown the whispers with parties, tried to forget the sting of being forgotten with late nights and louder company. There were rumors, always rumors, of arguments and heartbreak. Romances turned to feuds, promises turned to threats. Even those closest to him couldn't tell when the real pain started or when it became too much to bear. One evening, as guests lingered downstairs and laughter echoed faintly from below, a single sharp sound cut through the night. When they found him, it looked like something from the kind of stories he once saved the world from. A hero fallen, a room frozen in confusion. The cape still hung in his closet, the symbol of a legend who could lift buildings and outrun trains. But George Reeves was only human, and in the end, the world that made him a hero never noticed how deep his struggles had become. Lupe Velez. They called her the Mexican Spitfire, a whirlwind of energy who lit up the screen and left every room charged with electricity. Lupe Velez wasn't just another face in Hollywood. She was a storm, her accent and laughter rolling over the careful order of the industry like thunder. She fought for her place with a fearless spirit and a fire that couldn't be contained. But behind every bold headline and every dazzling photo, there was a young woman fighting battles that no one else could see. Lupe's rise was meteoric. The studios loved her when she made the money, when her wild eyes and quick tongue brought excitement to their silent frames. But in a world ruled by rigid ideas about who belonged and who didn't, her success was always fragile. She knew the rules. Be vibrant but never too bold. Charming but never too loud. Exotic but never out of control. Her relationships played out on the front page. Passionate romances and heartbreaks, whispered scandals, betrayals from those who promised to love her. She dreamed of being remembered as a true star, of leaving behind the gossip and the cruelty. She longed for a home, for a family, for a world where her joy didn't have to fight to survive. But the walls kept closing in. Studios that once begged for her time now turned their backs. Lovers who swore devotion left her stranded. Every slight, every closed door cut a little deeper. When she learned she would face motherhood alone, the burden of shame, fear, and loneliness became overwhelming. Lupe wanted her last act to be one of dignity, a glamorous, unforgettable scene where she would be immortalized as she wished. She prepared flowers, wrote a final message on her mirror in lipstick, and tried to turn her goodbye into a legend. But reality was not so kind. When they found her, the fantasy was shattered. There was no graceful ending, only sadness, confusion, and a legacy stained by those who wanted her forgotten. The industry that had built her up was quick to erase her, turning her story into little more than a rumor. Carol Landis. She had the kind of smile that could brighten the most crowded ballroom, and the sort of presence that made soldiers forget about the distant thunder of war. Carol Landis was more than just another starlet. She was the heartbeat of hope for those who needed to believe in something beautiful. She crossed oceans to entertain troops, lit up the silver screen with her laughter, and posed on magazine covers as the image of American spirit. But under the flashbulbs and adoration, there was a sadness growing that no spotlight could ever reach. Carol never fit neatly into the boxes that Hollywood designed for its leading ladies. She was too smart for her own good, too witty for those who wanted women to simply smile and stand still. She dreamed of serious roles, of recognition, not just for her face, but for her mind. She worked herself to the edge, tirelessly giving, always available, never saying no. The more she gave, the less she seemed to have for herself. Studio bosses used her, producers dangled promises, and the dream of true love stayed just out of reach. In the quiet moments, Carol found herself alone with her thoughts, wrestling with a heartbreak that refused to heal. She fell deeply, disastrously, for a man who belonged to another, hoping that maybe her devotion could rewrite the story. She waited for the phone to ring, for the promise to be kept, for someone to choose her first. What she got instead was silence, a chilling, endless silence that wrapped itself around her heart. On a night when the loneliness felt absolute, Carol made her final preparations with the same grace she'd shown to the world. She wrote a note, folded it carefully, and left it behind for the one person she loved most. When she was found, the world recoiled in shock, but Hollywood wasted no time in smoothing over the scandal. The headlines barely mentioned her passing. Studio executives whispered behind closed doors, and the story of her pain was tucked away as just another secret. Jean Seberg. She was the face of a revolution, her short hair and searching eyes the very definition of French New Wave cool. Jean Seberg was more than just an actress. She was a symbol of defiance, a muse for artists who wanted to shatter the old ways. Her performance in Breathless didn't just launch a film, it set off a tremor through cinema itself. To the world, Jean was confidence and style, a woman who belonged in every room she entered. But for Jean, every room became a place to hide, every glance a reminder that her life was never truly her own. Jean's story started far from the glitter of Paris and Hollywood, growing up in quiet Iowa, with dreams bigger than the horizon. She was discovered in a nationwide search, whisked away, and dropped straight into the deep end. The world applauded, but no one taught her how to swim in those treacherous waters. Stardom gave her access to places others could only imagine, but it took just as much as it gave. Studios expected perfection, the press demanded drama, and every misstep became a headline. She wasn't content to play the part of the silent beauty. June cared deeply about the world beyond the camera. She spoke out for justice, gave support to causes others were too afraid to touch, and made enemies in powerful places. The price for caring was high. The whispers started, then the lies. Her private life became public property, twisted and distorted until the truth was barely recognizable. Behind closed doors, the strain became unbearable. Friends noticed her growing more distant, her spark flickering under the weight of suspicion and loss. Her heartbreak was not just professional, but personal. She endured devastating losses, betrayals that left her breathless in a way no script could ever capture. The world outside moved on, but inside Jean's apartment the shadows gathered. The headlines that once celebrated her beauty now used her name as a punchline. Her cries for help were met with judgment or silence. Her kindness punished by those who couldn't see past their own prejudices. James Whale. He was the visionary who gave us monsters, creatures stitched together from shadow and longing, misunderstood and hunted by the very world they fascinated. But no monster James Whale brought to life was ever as haunted as the man behind the camera. In a town that thrives on illusion, he was one of the few who dared to be unapologetically himself, both in his art and in the way he moved through a world that was not always kind to outsiders. James Whale had once stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood, a director whose imagination transformed cheap sets and rubber masks into nightmares that would linger for generations. Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein. These were not just movies. They were statements, stories that questioned who gets to belong and who is pushed into the dark. Whale brought humanity to his monsters, a touch of loneliness to their terror, because he knew firsthand what it was to be set apart. But as the years rolled by, the applause faded. The parties grew smaller. Directors who once asked for his advice now passed him by with polite smiles. The world had changed, and Whale found himself cast out from the industry he'd helped shape. The roles he might have played as an elder statesman, a mentor, never materialized. He watched as the monsters he made immortal lived on in the memories of millions, while his own phone fell silent. His private battles only deepened with time. Old wounds from war, both physical and invisible, left him in constant pain. His days, once filled with the excitement of creation, grew heavy and monotonous. The people he loved moved on or disappeared, leaving him to the slow tick of a clock in a house too large for one person's footsteps. Even his final letter spoke more of relief than regret, a simple declaration that he had given all he could to a world that was no longer his. One bright California afternoon, Whale walked into his garden, as he had so many times before. But this time, there would be no return. His body was found in the pool, his pockets heavy with stones, his final scene perfectly choreographed by the director himself. There were no cameras, no curtain calls, just still water and a life that deserved more than silence. The industry that owed him so much offered a handful of condolences and then moved on to new dreams. Dorothy Dandridge. She was the woman who broke down barriers, who stood in the glare of Hollywood's unforgiving spotlight and demanded to be seen. Not just as a beauty, not just as a voice, but as a force. Dorothy Dandridge came from nothing and rose to heights that seemed impossible for someone who looked like her in a world built to keep her out. With every step on the red carpet, every smile for the cameras, she carried not only her own hopes, but those of an entire generation waiting for someone to open the door. The world saw her as elegant, poised, and impossibly talented. With every note she sang, every line she delivered, she revealed a soul both fragile and indomitable. But what they didn't see was the cost. Dorothy fought for every inch of her career, for every line in a script that tried to shrink her brilliance, for every moment when she was allowed to be more than the sum of old prejudices and small-minded rules. The love she wanted, the respect she deserved always seemed to slip away just as she reached for it. Her private life was a battlefield. In public, she smiled for photographers and recited pleasantries, but inside she was waging a war against isolation and heartbreak. The roles that once arrived with fanfare stopped coming. The adulation of the crowd faded into whispers behind closed doors. The men who promised her everything gave her only loneliness. Doors closed, and she felt the chill of an industry that used her as a symbol but never truly let her in. Her final years were marked by struggle. Financial troubles mounted, betrayals stacked upon betrayals, and the endless weight of having to be perfect in a world that barely saw her at all. She turned to trusted voices for help, only to find that even those had grown distant. One quiet evening, behind the door of a modest apartment, Dorothy Dandridge slipped away from the world that had once put her on a pedestal and then so swiftly forgot her. The headlines, quick to celebrate her triumphs, barely lingered on her passing. Veronica Lake. She was the woman every camera adored, her name whispered with awe and longing in every darkened theater. Veronica Lake became an icon with just a glance, her famous waterfall of hair hiding one eye and sparking a global trend. Her roles in film noir defined an era, sly, mysterious, untouchable. She moved through her world with an effortless charm, as if nothing could touch her. But what no one saw was the storm behind the cool facade, the deep cracks that fame and expectation left in their wake. Veronica arrived in Hollywood as a sensation, and for a few dazzling years, she seemed unstoppable. Studios clamored for her, magazines chronicled her every move, and the public demanded more of the woman who had turned a hairstyle into a legend. But fame in Hollywood is always fleeting. As quickly as they raised her up, the powers that be began to look for faults, for reasons to withdraw their affection. Veronica's fiery spirit, so captivating on screen, was called difficult behind the scenes. Her independence was recast as arrogance, her honesty as trouble. Roles started to dry up. The scripts she was offered became smaller, the money thinner, the expectations more humiliating. Her marriage, already battered by the strain of competing egos and public scrutiny, finally shattered. She drifted from place to place, the glamour slowly peeling away, replaced by shadows of regret and longing. In time, she was forced to take jobs that would have made the Veronica Lake of yesterday weep. Bartending in cheap hotels, answering questions from strangers who wondered if she was really that woman from the movies. Alcohol became both comfort and cage, blurring the sharp edges of disappointment and masking the loneliness that followed her like a shadow. She watched her own legend crumble, piece by piece, as friends faded and the calls from studios stopped coming. The world that had once demanded her presence now barely noticed her absence. Peg and whistle. The city stretched out beneath her, glittering with promise and secrets, as if every light was a wish waiting to come true. For Peg and Whistle, that shimmering view was both an invitation and a warning. She had arrived in Hollywood with dreams packed tight inside a suitcase, dreams that had survived small-town stages, survived the hard grind of Broadway, survived the lonely nights when only ambition kept her warm. In her heart, she believed she could find a place among the legends. Peg's beauty was subtle but undeniable. She had a quiet poise that set her apart, a sense of dignity that came from years of stage work before the cameras ever found her. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, her determination, her almost stubborn hopefulness. She landed a contract, posed for studio portraits, and waited for the kind of role that could change a life. The stories about Hollywood's magic never mentioned the waiting, the endless auditions, the fear of being forgotten before you'd even begun. The city moved quickly, with little patience for doubt. Peg's first big break was also her last. The phone stopped ringing, the scripts stopped coming, and the studio's promises dried up like morning mist. Each setback pressed heavier on her heart. In a city obsessed with new faces, yesterday's news faded fast. The friends who had celebrated her arrival now shuffled past with apologetic smiles. The joy that once filled her dreams was slowly replaced by a chill, creeping sense that she'd come so far only to find emptiness. One evening, as the city below twinkled with possibility, Peg climbed the steep slope to the top of Mount Lee. The giant white letters of Hollywoodland loomed above, bright but unreachable. She paused by the first letter, her letter, and let the night air carry her silent goodbye across the valley. When the sun rose, the world learned that another hopeful had been claimed by the city's hunger. The note she left behind was short, the words heavy with the sorrow of promises broken and dreams betrayed. Freddy Prince. He was a flash of laughter in a world that too often forgot how to smile. Freddy Prince burst onto television screens with a charm that was impossible to resist. Audiences loved him as the quick-witted Chico on Chico and the Man, a show that made millions laugh and gave a new generation a voice they'd never seen before. With every punchline, Every raised eyebrow, Freddy seemed untouchable, a shooting star racing across the late-night sky. But stardom is a tricky companion. Behind the scenes, Freddie was just a young man from New York, carrying the expectations of his family, his community, and a rapidly growing fan base. He was barely out of his teens when he became a household name, and the pressure to be the life of the party never let up. There was always another show to do, another joke to write, another headline to fill. The laughter he created for others became a mask that he wore, one that hid his own doubts and fears. Those closest to Freddie saw the cracks in the surface, the exhaustion that came from carrying too much hope for too many people. He struggled to find balance between his public persona and the quiet, thoughtful person he was in private. Fame magnified every mistake, every stumble. The more people praised his talent, the more he wondered if he could ever truly live up to their expectations. The world wanted the bright, shining Freddie, never seeing how much energy it took to keep the light burning. As the demands grew heavier, the solace Freddie found in his work faded. The stage that had once felt like home now felt like a place he had to escape. Personal troubles began to multiply, and even those who loved him struggled to understand the weight he carried. One evening in the quiet of his apartment, far from the laughter of television studios, Freddie's journey ended. The shock that followed rippled through Hollywood and every home that had welcomed him into their living rooms. Delita. Her voice could turn sorrow into music, her beauty made her unforgettable, and her life became a story told in the shadows behind the stage lights. Delita was more than just a singer or an actress. She was a phenomenon. From the bustling neighborhoods of Cairo to the electric cabarets of Paris, she reinvented herself again and again, pouring every heartbreak, every triumph, every dream into the songs that would echo for generations. Delita's rise was dazzling. Her music soared across languages and borders, and everywhere she went, people found something in her voice that reminded them of their own pain and hope. Her eyes sparkled with a mysterious melancholy that the camera could never quite capture. In every performance, she seemed to live 100 lives, each one more passionate and tragic than the last. Behind every success, though, there was a loss that seemed to linger, a weight she carried quietly through the years. The world adored Delita, but her personal life was marked by heartbreak that would have broken a lesser spirit. She lost loved ones to tragedy, endured betrayals that left her reeling, and fought her way through moments when the future seemed impossibly dark. Each loss was reflected in her music, each grief woven into her performances. Her fans felt her pain and her joy in every note, but few realized just how deeply those wounds ran. Delita tried to build a fortress around her heart, surrounding herself with friends, art, and travel, but even the most beautiful walls could not keep out the memories. The applause faded with the final encore each night, leaving her alone with the silence that follows every song. In private, the struggle grew heavier. She sought comfort in the familiar, in the rituals of performance and the fleeting embrace of a stage light, but the emptiness always crept back in. When Delita's journey reached its final act, the world was left stunned by the suddenness of her departure. The note she left behind spoke of exhaustion, a life that had become too heavy to carry. Gia Scala. She arrived in Hollywood with a striking presence and an air of mystery that set her apart from the crowd. Gia Scala was not just another beautiful face. There was something in her gaze that hinted at stories untold, at emotions too deep for words. Born to an Italian father and an Irish mother, Gia's life was shaped by constant movement, a search for belonging that followed her even as her star began to rise. Gia's journey to fame was as turbulent as it was promising. She captured attention on the big screen, most memorably in The Guns of Navarone, where her quiet intensity and natural grace brought depth to every scene. Directors praised her talent, fans admired her charm, but the world behind the cameras was not as welcoming as it seemed. Hollywood, for all its glamour, offered little kindness to those who did not fit its mold or who showed vulnerability in a place that rewarded only perfection. As the years went by, Gia's roles became fewer, her appearances more sporadic. She struggled to find her place, not just in the industry, but in her own life. The parties grew lonelier, the nights longer, and the dreams that once seemed so close began to drift out of reach. She turned to old friends and family for comfort, but found herself caught between two worlds, never truly at home in either. The lights that had once welcomed her began to dim, and the city that promised everything turned away with indifference. Despite her struggles, Gia fought hard to keep her footing, holding on to hope even as the ground shifted beneath her. She masked her pain with smiles, pushed forward with determination, and never stopped believing that things could turn around. But the pressure of expectation, the isolation of fame, and the ache of disappointment weighed heavier with each passing year. The battle became one fought mostly in silence behind closed doors. When Gia Scala's story came to its end, there were few headlines and even fewer answers. Those who had known her spoke of her kindness, her complexity, and the unfulfilled potential that made her loss all the more poignant. Charles Boyer. He was the embodiment of elegance, the man whose gentle voice and smoldering gaze could bring even the most stoic hearts to flutter. Charles Boyer enchanted audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, becoming the very image of romance and refinement in a world that often craved escape. He shared the screen with legendary leading ladies and brought to life characters marked by quiet strength and irresistible charm. But even a legend can find himself lost when the world behind the spotlight grows cold and silent. Charles built his career on love stories, tales of passion that audiences believed could conquer any obstacle. Yet behind the curtain, he clung to a love far deeper and more enduring than any role he ever played. His marriage to his wife, Pat, became the bedrock of his existence, a partnership filled with devotion, laughter, and understanding, even as the world outside changed and his career entered its twilight. Together, they weathered storms of fame and fortune, relying on each other when applause faded into memory. But as time wore on, life's relentless march brought sorrow that even the strongest bonds could not keep at bay. When Pat fell gravely ill, Charles was by her side every moment, refusing to let her face the shadows alone. The illness stole her strength, but not the love they shared. And when she was finally gone, the world he had so carefully built seemed to crumble around him. The man who had comforted millions with his steady presence was left alone, his anchor gone. The depth of his grief was immeasurable. Friends and family tried to offer solace, but nothing could fill the emptiness Pat's absence left behind. Charles wandered through the rooms of their home, surrounded by memories that once brought joy and now only echoed with loss. The world moved on, but for him, time seemed to stand still. The city that once glimmered with promise now seemed to hold only reminders of what had been. In those final days, Charles Boyer's heart simply could not bear the weight of separation. He made his exit quietly, in the home that had held so much happiness, leaving behind a legacy of cinematic grace and a love story that was both his greatest triumph and his greatest sorrow. Virginia Woolf. Her words painted entire worlds, her thoughts weaving through the minds of readers long after the last page was turned. Virginia Woolf was a force in literature, her writing forever shifting how we see memory, time, and the inner storms we hide from view. She inspired not only writers but filmmakers and dreamers everywhere, her influence rippling across oceans and generations. Yet behind her celebrated works and carefully crafted sentences, there was always a sense of fragility, a heart that felt everything too deeply, and a mind that sometimes wandered into darker waters. Born into a family of thinkers and creators, Virginia grew up with the sound of ideas humming in every room. Her world was filled with art, debate, and the subtle battles that come from standing out in an era that demanded conformity. She carved out a place in the literary world through talent and sheer determination, building a circle of artists who admired her courage and her insight. Yet the expectations placed on her grew heavier with each success, and the shadows she fought in her private hours grew longer. Virginia's life was marked by moments of incredible light and harrowing darkness. She found joy in the small moments, writing by a window, walking in the garden, laughter shared over afternoon tea. But these joys were often chased by waves of melancholy, deep doubts, and the invisible weight of the world's demands. Her family's losses, the pressure of public life, and the relentless self-criticism that drove her art also took their toll. Through it all, Virginia kept writing, turning her struggles into stories that comforted others, even as they cost her so much. But as the storms inside her grew fiercer, it became harder to find her way back to the surface. The love of her life, Leonard, stood by her through every trial, offering unwavering support. Yet there are some battles we must face alone, and Virginia, in her final days, felt herself drifting beyond the reach of those who cared for her most. When her journey ended, it was not with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet dignity befitting a life spent searching for meaning and truth. She left behind letters filled with gratitude and tenderness, a legacy of words that would outlast any grief. Robert Walker. He was the boy next door, the fresh-faced charmer whose sincerity and quiet strength made him a favorite in the golden age of Hollywood. Robert Walker possessed a vulnerability that shone through every role, drawing audiences in and making them believe in the power of kindness, even in a world that could be so cold. His performances, especially in films like Strangers on a Train, revealed a depth that few could match, a rawness that felt as if he was living the part, not just playing it. But the tenderness that captivated audiences also made Robert especially sensitive to the storms that often came with fame. Born into modest circumstances, he quickly found himself swept up by Hollywood's promise, a place that could turn dreams into reality or nightmares. The pressure to remain perfect, to keep smiling no matter what, weighed on him. Behind the scenes, the demands of work and the challenges of personal life grew more tangled with every year. Love, which should have been a refuge, became complicated and painful. His highly publicized marriage to fellow star Jennifer Jones ended in heartbreak, the dissolution playing out in the papers for all to see. The pain of separation, the loss of the family life he cherished, left deep scars. He struggled to find peace, turning to work with renewed determination, hoping that each new role might bring healing, or at least distraction. But the emotional wounds lingered, often invisible to those around him. As the years passed, Robert's gentle spirit began to show signs of strain. He fought against anxiety and loneliness, seeking relief wherever he could find it. The world kept asking for more, and he tried to give everything he had, even as the spark within him flickered. Those who knew him saw the toll it took, the way hope and exhaustion battled behind his eyes. These were the real stories, of dreams built and broken, of brilliance shining and then vanishing into silence. Hollywood's greatest legends left behind more than unforgettable films. They left behind a warning, a plea, and a legacy written not only in lights, but in heartbreak. If these stories moved you, if you believe the truth deserves to be heard above the myth, don't let them be forgotten. Like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from behind the spotlight. Your voice helps keep their memories alive and brings the human side of fame out of the shadows. Thank you for watching.